She fell head over heels instantly for him.
What made you want to get into special education?
It's a challenge for sure. I don't know, we'll see where it goes. I love kids.
Oh, really?
Do you think you're a force for good?
No. No, I'd like to settle down somewhere, make some real money.
Well, I think that a person can get whatever they want, if they want it bad enough.
In sickness and in health, better for...
Okay, now hold your horses, mister.
They were such a good match. They were just so much in love.
I hate that I have to go back tomorrow. So, Susie, where does this leave us?
Susie and Calvin were best friends. They were like two peas in a pod. They didn't hide anything from anybody. They shared everything that they had with everybody.
A year later, once Calvin is honorably discharged, he can't shake Susie from his heart. He gets a job as a lab tech and relocates to Beaumont to be closer to her.
Pick one.
That one.
Okay.
It's the shiniest one. Well, what did you wish for?
But you'd say yes?
Say yep.
Will you marry me?
Yes!
They did make each other better people. I know she would have followed Calvin anywhere.
But now, the day after Good Friday, Susie has vanished. And Calvin and his mother-in-law, Ray, are beyond worried.
Come on, Calvin. You go get cleaned up. You and me are going down to the police. Tell them what you told me. See what they think. I'll drive.
Saturday mornings are usually slow going at the Beaumont Police Department. Investigators don't have much to do but wait for trouble.
Detective Thomas? Really? How old? How long? All right, split them up. We'll join them in a second.
Someone lost their Easter eggs?
Young woman's missing. Grad student. Mom and husband are out front.
Let's do it.
This is my wife, Suzanne Knuth. She didn't come home last night. I mean, she disappeared right there in the middle of the street.
Hold up. Let's hear it from the beginning.
So we just finished up some shopping down at the Gateway Mall. I guess it was around 6:30. We're out in the parking lot and my old car wouldn't start. Come on.
Cal, not again. I thought you were gonna get this fixed last week.
With whose money? Well, I live about a mile away, straight down College Street. So
y'all decide to hoof it home?
we managed okay for a bit, but Susie's feet weren't up for walking.
Cal, babe, I can't walk all the way home. Not in these heels.
Listen, I'm gonna run ahead and I'll go get the other car and then I'll come back and get you. Just stay put here, okay?
Fine by me.
I'll be back as soon as I can.
They had a dinner date to go to, and they were already running late, so he was going to jog ahead to get the other car since their car broke down at the shopping center, and they didn't want to be late for this party.
I reckon I was gone 10 minutes max.
And?
And when I got back, poof, she was gone.
What do you mean by gone?
Gone. Look, I don't know. I don't know why she didn't wait for me.
So she just vanished?
So you're telling me Calvin went home and she still wasn't there?
That's what Cal told me, yes, sir.
Susie's a grown woman. Maybe she just got tired of waiting.
For 10 minutes? No way.
Maybe she just left and went somewhere else or met up with somebody.
You don't know Susie. She would have gone back to the house. She would have called.
My mom knows that Susie would never leave anywhere without calling somebody first, especially Mom.
Let me ask you this. Just how well do you know your son-in-law?
In missing person cases, you usually focus immediately on a spouse or a parent or kinfolk. At first, they did look at the husband as a possible suspect in the case.
What happened next?
I drove up and down all over town looking for her. Called her name out a few times. Never seen her anywhere.
Are you aware of any problems in the marriage?
Not that I'd know of, but their marriage is their own.
Any arguing, any issues between them?
I don't know. They squabble over money here and there. Calvin never thinks they have enough, and Susie wants to travel.
Just money? Nothing else?
Susie's a homebody, she really is, but at the same time, she's always wanted a little bit more out of life. She wants to move away someday, see what's out there beyond Beaumont.
And how does Calvin feel about that?
Oh, that isn't his thing. He's happy enough right here.
So after she disappeared, you were alone the whole night? You didn't get anyone to help you look?
Well, no. After a while, I just went home. Figured she'd come walking through the door at some point. She never did.
Calvin didn't have an alibi. We had no way at that point of knowing whether he was making the story up or not.
Tell me, son. Your wife ever get you good and mad?
We argued on occasion, but no more than any other couple. Nothing recent.
Look, Detective, tomorrow's Easter. I want my family together. So let me ask you a question. What are y'all gonna do to find my daughter?
Calvin seemed genuine and heartfelt, but so do a lot of guys who report their loved one missing.
Over at the Gateway Shopping Mall, the detectives find Calvin's car, right where he said it'd be. From there, they retrace the couple's path, hoping that somebody saw something.
Pardon me, ma'am. You happen to notice either of these people passing by here yesterday evening around 6:30 or 7?
Well, let me see. Yeah, I did. Couldn't miss them. They're out there on the sidewalk.
Sure it was them.
Of course, I'm sure. They were going at it something fierce.
On a Friday evening, Susie Knuth disappeared off a street in Beaumont, Texas. A store clerk saw her and her husband having a fight.
I was closing up early. They were hard to miss. That guy was right up in her face, and she was just giving back just as good as she got. She was hollering, wouldn't stop hollering, till he finally said, "Shut up." I heard that.
He said they didn't argue much. Wonder what else he left out. Ma'am, you absolutely certain?
It was them. What's this all about?
A missing girl.
Calvin never mentioned anything about having an argument with his wife before she went missing, and that kind of raised our suspicions at that point and a red flag to keep him in mind as a possible suspect in her disappearance.
Why do you think Calvin didn't tell us about the argument?
Certainly don't make him look good.
Or her? She could have up and run off on him, hitched a ride with somebody.
detectives continue their walk up College Street until they find another witness, a garage mechanic.
Yeah, I saw her. Out on the sidewalk.
What time?
Maybe 6:30 or so. I don't wear a watch.
What did you see?
Car pulled over. She was getting in. It was a gray Oldsmobile Cutlass two-door.
That's awfully specific.
Look at me. There's one thing I can tell you. It's what car it was. That was definitely the girl. Kinda cute.
What about the driver? Was it that guy?
That I don't know. But the girl was definitely on the Cutlass.
Thing is, Calvin and Susie don't own a gray Cutlass.
So we wanted to figure out who it was that might have picked her up in that gray Cutlass. It might have been somebody that Susie knew.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
When missing person cases like this show up, oftentimes it's simply a matter of the girl wanted to leave.
When we got to the location of where she disappeared, after we found out where that was, I noticed the grass had indentations in it, like there was a scuffle of some type there. And we had already been notified that her purse was found at that location. And it seemed logical that the grass being indented like it was, there was a struggle there. The gray Cutlass became a focal point of our investigation at this point because of the information that we had received about her being in that Cutlass at that location where her purse was found. And so we followed up on all that tips, and our focus was mainly to try to locate that particular vehicle.
One thing's for sure, if they're gonna unravel the riddle of Susie's vanishing act, Beaumont PD needs to find that Cutlass, and quick. That Easter Sunday, investigators issue a missing person bulletin with a description of the Cutlass.
In small towns, usually you will receive some tips, but larger communities, Beaumont, Galveston County, Jefferson County, not so much. You'll get the usual people that will always call you and say, oh, I saw something, and you take those with a grain of salt. But as far as valid tips as to missing persons, you don't get that many.
This is O'Quinn. You saw her? Okay, hold on. Let me get this down. Port Arthur? Uh-huh. Okay, we'll check it out, thanks. Got another sighting.
We followed up on every tip that came in, but all of them proved to be negative.
If you get tips at all that seem to be valid tips, then yes, you concentrate all your efforts in that direction. We always investigate every tip to the fullest.
Investigators also keep an eye out for their one lead, the mysterious gray Cutlass.
We figured since Calvin left her that close to that area that it might be illogical that the car would be in that area.
Turns out that Cutlass is a popular model in this part of Texas.
Whoa! Larry, did you catch that?
Catch what?
Let me spin it around real quick.
At the point in the investigation, anybody that owned a Cutlass that we could locate, we wanted to talk to them, hoping to locate Susie.
That's good eyes. Bet we're about 2 miles from where that girl went missing. I'm gonna run this tag.
I'm gonna talk to this guy. Excuse me, sir. I'm Detective O'Quinn, Beaumont PD. Mind if I ask you a few questions, particularly regarding this vehicle?
We found one gray Cutlass near where Susie disappeared, and at that point we were hopeful.
Detective Thomas here. You run a tag for me?
Is this your car?
Yeah. Why?
That comes back, Rocky Dubois.
Rocky Dubois. Can you run that name for me?
Mind telling me where you were last Friday? Late afternoon, early evening?
He's clear. For now. This fellow was in lockup over Easter weekend.
That's right. I don't know what y'all are fishing for, but it ain't me.
Did anyone borrow your car last Friday?
How should I know? I wasn't here.
All right, Rocky. If I found out otherwise, we're coming back. Have a good day.
This seemed to be a pretty good lead for us because it's a possibility that information that he had might be fruitful.
Looks like they've got a known criminal in the area who owns a car like the one Susie was seen getting into. But before long, another tip comes in.
Detective Thomas here.
Yeah, this is Bob Wicker, calling about my nephew, Chester Wicker. I think he may know something about that missing girl of yours.
Some tipsters call in and seem to have about 100% being sure that they have something for us, but Mr. Wicker's tip might have been about 50%.
Would you mind if we met up somewhere?
You name the place, I'm there. What do you think Chester might know about this missing girl?
Well, something just didn't seem right the night that he called me.
What time did he call?
Around midnight. Said his car got stuck about an hour south of here, down toward Galveston.
He wanted you to come help him out.
At first, I couldn't figure out why Bob Wicker was telling us this information.
Jeez, Chester, you really screwed up this time, huh?
Yeah, she stuck pretty good, huh? Guess I had to come and drive her through all these back roads.
Yeah, well, it happens.
I've never been able to get that out of my mind. It seemed so suspicious, so I came to look for them, and they're gone. He must have trashed them. Now, why would he do that?
Mrs. Felder, you're trespassing. Why don't you come down to the station and we'll talk this out?
Oh, shoot. Hang on. Okay, he's here.
Mrs. Felder, listen to me. I need you to get out of there now. Mrs. Felder. Mrs. Felder, are you there?
My mom should have never snuck back in their house. I know it's her business, but it's still none of her business. The police were taking care of it. Mom should have never gone into Calvin and Susie's house for any reason without somebody being with her.
Nevertheless, it isn't looking good for Calvin or Susie.
Given what we know, we suspected foul play at this time, and so we started looking for Susie in places that we didn't expect her to be alive.
A half hour up the Neches River from Beaumont, the Big Thicket Swamp lives up to its name. Ancient pine and cypress grow 160 acres thick along the cold black water.
You see anything over there?
Nothing but a bunch of mud and grime.
At the time that Susie disappeared, Calvin seemed to be a worried husband, but we figured him going out with us on these searches, he might give himself away at some point.
Man, I hope we don't find her here.
Yeah, me neither.
Calvin, a couple things that come up I wanted to run by you about what your role might be in all this.
I know. I know it looks bad.
Let's go back to the night Susie vanished. You have an eyewitness that saw you and Susie in a big blowout right before she vanished. Is that true?
Yeah.
Why didn't you say anything about that?
I didn't want to put it out there. It didn't matter.
And it might make you look more guilty. All right? What are you arguing about?
We were late for dinner.
Cal, babe, I can't walk all the way home. Not in these heels.
Susie was dragging on purpose. I got annoyed, and she got mad at me. Look, we argued sometimes. It's married life.
You have to admit, your whole story's pretty out there. You know, if we can't find her, it's going to be hard to have her officially declared dead.
I'm not thinking about that right now.
Won't that be a problem collecting on the life insurance?
What?
You're the sole beneficiary of her policy. Nice chunk of change for a fellow who wants more money.
No. You think I killed my wife for money? I just want to find her. She's my wife. I would never lay a finger on her, ever.
Is that right? Calvin, we have an eyewitness that picked you out of a photo lineup.
Get over here! Get your hands off of me! Let go!
That's a lie.
Said you were using Susie as a punching bag.
That's a
Threw her in
lie!
the car that night.
I was hoping for a confession because of us pushing him hard, but he didn't crack. Calvin stuck to his story about what happened.
I miss Susie, and I love her. Stop wasting your time on me.
All right, let me ask you this. Does the name Chester Wicker ring any bells in your ears? Is he a buddy of yours?
No, I've never heard of that name before in my life.
Are you sure about that?
About an hour's ride southeast, Chester Wicker's Uncle Bob leads investigators to a marshy spit of land near the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, this is it. This is where I helped Chester get his cutlass unstuck.
All right. Let's look around and see if we can find something.
Police spend days searching the bogs by Galveston Bay and in the Great Thicket Swamp for any signs of Susie. But they come up empty.
So where are we at with this thing?
Well, we got a cutlass belonging to one Chester Wicker, who's vanished into thin air. And we got a witness who ID'd Calvin as the one who beat her up and put her in the car.
Yeah, but was he? She was the only one who saw the guy. What if she's wrong?
What are you thinking?
I don't think you're gonna like this, but...
Arrest warrant for kidnapping. Met the bus at the bus station in Houston.
Beaumont PD enlists Barney to act as a decoy in the hopes Chester will walk right into their hands.
Chester Wicker!
What is going on? I didn't do anything wrong.
The right to remain silent?
It had been 4 long weeks, and we could relax and exhale that we finally had our guy in custody. But we still had a lot of questions that were unanswered at this point. We still wanted him to take us to where she was, and he had the impression that we knew already, and so he felt like he had to go ahead and tell us.
Chester, we have witnesses, we have evidence. We know what you did to that girl back in Beaumont. There's no way out of this, son.
Look, we want to keep an open mind here. Why don't you just tell us what happened? Maybe things will go a little easier on you if you come clean.
Damn it, you don't know what happened. It's all her fault, and now I'm screwed. I was on my way home, and there she was. She was just standing there on College Street. Hey, darling. You stuck there, or are you selling something? I thought she maybe needed some help, that's all. She smiled at me. I smiled back. I could tell she really liked me.
Screw off, loser. My husband's coming back. Get your kick somewhere else.
But something about the way she was talking to me. Like she was too good for me. I got real angry.
So what happened next?
Wasn't gonna take no from someone like her standing on a street corner.
Hey, you can't talk. What are you doing? What are you doing? Let go of me! Oh my God. What are you doing? Get out of here!
Chester knew where he could find some privacy. He headed south till he reached a patch of swampy wilds down near the Gulf.
Tried to, you know, get it going with her. She wouldn't have it. She put up one hell of a fight, though. She kept hollering, screaming, and scratching me up.
Must have made you real mad, I bet.
Oh, yeah. She wasn't gonna play along. And I knew I couldn't just let her go. So I started squeezing. Then I buried her. And that was it. And I would have been fine. My car got stuck and I had to call my uncle. What was her name, anyway?
Her name was Suzanne.
Suzanne Knuth.
Suzanne. Pretty name.
At dawn the next morning, Chester leads detectives to the desolate spot where he left Susie far off the road. It's a grisly sight.
In my entire career, I've never seen such a horrible thing. She tried to claw her way out because he buried her alive.
On February 5th, 1981, Chester Wicker is convicted and sentenced to death for the abduction, attempted rape, and murder of Suzanne Knuth, and executed by lethal injection.
I think justice was served until he was put to sleep. And I say put to sleep because I think of him as a dog. When you get sick, you put a dog down. Well, they put Wicker down because he was sick in the mind.
Calvin Knuth is cleared of all suspicion, but still he struggles to put the tragedy behind him. Eventually, he remarries and has a daughter, but he will always regret his spur-of-the-moment decision to leave Susie alone that Good Friday evening.
Calvin has been able to move on with a new wife and a new family because he has done the same thing I've done. He's let it go. I don't know if he's forgiven, and I know he hasn't forgotten, but he's let it go.
There's an irony to the story. If not for the muck and mire trapping Chester's car, his uncle would have never reported him. And his brutal crime might have gone undiscovered. Usually, the swamp only witnesses a murder. But sometimes, the swamp strikes back.
There are some crimes that frighten people because of what happened in a single night. A single house, a single burst of violence that seems to tear through ordinary life like a storm. And then there are crimes that frighten people for a far colder reason, because they did not explode into public view all at once. They sat quietly for years. They lived behind a closed apartment door, behind a pair of glasses, behind a hesitant voice and an awkward half-smile, behind the kind of face a stranger might forget within minutes. The horror did not announce itself with spectacle. It accumulated in private. It deepened in silence. It waited inside a routine so ordinary that the truth, when it finally surfaced, felt less like the solving of a crime and more like the opening of a sealed chamber no human being should ever have built. That is where the story begins. Not at the end with the flashing lights and the headlines and the collective recoil of a nation, but in the uneasy territory before revelation, when the man at the center of it all still moved through Milwaukee like a dim figure at the edge of other people's attention. Jeffrey Dahmer did not look like the monster people imagine when they picture evil. He did not seem theatrical. He did not carry the obvious force of someone who dominates a room. If anything, he often appeared subdued, almost drained, a man who seemed to live in some internal weather system no one else could quite feel. That is part of what makes this case so enduringly disturbing. The violence was not only severe. It was hidden inside banality. It grew in the middle of apartment buildings on city streets, in bars and bus routes and ordinary encounters, in the kind of urban loneliness that allows people to pass each other by without asking too many questions. The fear this case leaves behind is not the fear of a sudden attack from the darkness. It is the fear of what can take shape when alienation, compulsion, secrecy, and opportunity begin feeding one another behind the thin walls of everyday life. Long before the public knew the full name and face of Jeffrey Dahmer, there were warning signs scattered like broken glass across the years, signs too isolated, too misunderstood, or too briefly noticed to form a complete picture. A strange young man, an odor drifting from a residence, and explained away. Encounters with police that seemed troubling, but not yet catastrophic. People who survived long enough to sense danger, and then lost sight of it before anyone else understood what it meant. A killer does not become terrifying only because of what he does. He becomes terrifying because of what the world around him fails to see while he is doing it. In the Dahmer case, that failure is part of the story's deepest chill. This is not only the story of a predator. It is the story of how a predator can remain intact inside a modern city. How he can build a private kingdom of control while the public world continues outside with all its ordinary noise. Traffic, arguments, laughter, work shifts, and late-night errands. People slept, dated, fought, watched television, went to school, caught buses, and stepped over small signs of neglect without imagining that only a short distance away, another human being had been reduced to an object inside someone else's sick design. The contrast is almost impossible to absorb. On one side of the wall, regular life. On the other side, a reality so warped that even experienced investigators would later struggle to describe it without sounding as though they had stepped into fiction. But this story is not fiction, and that is exactly why it lingers. It happened in real rooms, to real people in real time, while the city kept moving. There is a particular kind of dread that belongs to cases like this. It does not come only from brutality. It comes from duration, from repetition, from the idea that the crimes were not acts of sudden frenzy, but parts of an escalating pattern, each one nested inside the next, each one shaping the offender's sense that he could continue, refine, conceal, and return. That sense of continuity changes the emotional atmosphere of the case. It means the story cannot be understood as one isolated collapse into violence. It must be understood as a slow-building structure of obsession and domination, one that grew stronger each time it went undetected. The apartment at the center of the later revelations has become almost mythic in public memory. But before it was a symbol, it was simply a place. A rented space. A door in a hallway. A unit among other units. That is the unbearable truth underneath all the sensational language that would come later. The setting was not some haunted ruin already marked by evil. It was ordinary housing in an ordinary city, and the ordinariness of it only sharpened the obscenity of what unfolded there. Because what Jeffrey Dahmer created was not merely a series of murders. It was a private system of possession. He did not seem content with ending lives. He seemed driven by something even more chilling, the desire to erase separation itself. To stop other people from leaving, refusing, changing, or existing beyond his control. That psychological hunger, once it is understood, casts the whole case in a different light. This was not random violence. It was intimate, repetitive, and deeply rooted in the offender's inability to tolerate other human beings as fully independent lives. He wanted presence without resistance, bodies without boundaries, connection without mutuality. And because reality could never give him that, he turned to coercion, confinement, and death. That is what makes the case feel so spiritually claustrophobic. The victims were not simply targeted. They were drawn into a closed world organized around one man's need to dominate what he could never truly possess. Yet even that description must be held carefully, because the danger in telling a story like this is that the killer's pathology can begin to overshadow the people he destroyed. And this case, perhaps more than many others, demands resistance to that pull. Jeffrey Dahmer became infamous, but infamy is a trap. It can turn the offender into the center of gravity and reduce everyone else to shadows around him. The truth is the opposite. The moral center of this story belongs to the young men and boys whose lives were interrupted, stolen, and in many cases treated with a level of disrespect so extreme that even decades later it still feels difficult to put into language. They were not symbols. They were sons, brothers, friends, classmates, workers, dreamers, teenagers in transition, young adults in uncertain cities, people carrying all the ordinary hopes and confusions of life forward before they crossed the path of a man who saw vulnerability as opportunity. Some were isolated. Some were trusting. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong hour, standing near a bus stop, walking toward a car, stepping into an encounter that seemed, at first glance, survivable and mundane. That is where the horror begins in practical terms, in the gap between appearance and reality. A quiet invitation, an offer of money, a conversation that seems strange but not impossible. A room entered under the assumption that the worst thing waiting there might be discomfort or regret, not annihilation. That is the geography of the Dahmer case. Not open fields or highways or distant wilderness, but threshold spaces where urban anonymity meets private danger. Bars, sidewalks, apartment entries, late-night streets, temporary intimacies between strangers. He operated in a world where many people, especially young men at the margins, could disappear without immediate public alarm. That fact is not incidental. It is central. The case exposes not only the mind of the killer, but the social hierarchy around him. The unequal urgency with which certain disappearances are treated, the way poverty, race, sexuality, youth, and social invisibility can combine to make someone easier to prey upon and harder to protect. That dimension gives the case a second layer of moral weight. It is not only about one man's depravity. It is also about the spaces in society where depravity finds less resistance because the people most at risk are not always granted full institutional concern. The city in this story is therefore more than background. Milwaukee becomes part of the emotional architecture of the case, a city of neighborhoods. Factory rhythms, apartment blocks, summer heat, winter gray, taverns, churches, bus lines, corner stores, and private hardships hidden behind curtains. It is a city where people can live close enough to hear each other and still remain strangers. That is true of many American cities, and perhaps that is another reason this case lodged itself so deeply in the national imagination. It suggested that the terrifying thing was not just Jeffrey Dahmer himself, but the world that allowed him to remain unbroken for so long. A world where neighbors notice some things, but not enough. Where authority intervened sometimes, but not decisively. Where survivors' warnings did not always become action quickly enough. Where the social fabric was strong enough to keep people living side by side and weak enough to let one apartment become a chamber of sustained private horror. There is also something especially haunting about the emotional texture of Dahmer's public presence. Bundy-style charm is one kind of menace, smooth, confident, manipulative. Dahmer's menace was different. It wore vacancy instead of charisma. He could appear shy, hesitant, even passive. That made him easy to underestimate. He did not stride into rooms like a man announcing power. He often seemed more like someone people looked past. But being overlooked can be its own camouflage. A man who appears socially awkward may trigger discomfort, but not necessarily fear. A man who seems lonely may attract suspicion in small doses, but not the kind of urgent scrutiny that stops him. The hook of this story, then, is not simply that a serial killer lived in Milwaukee. It is that his crimes grew inside a strange zone of social invisibility, where unease rarely crystallized into intervention until after irreparable damage had been done. If there is one image that captures the beginning of this case, it is not the later photographs from inside the apartment, not the courtroom, not the squad cars outside the building. It is the image of normal life continuing around a hidden center of decay. A hallway outside an apartment door, a neighbor turning a key, a television murmuring through a wall, someone carrying groceries up a stairwell, a summer evening settling over the street, somewhere a radio playing, somewhere a bus braking, somewhere laughter from a nearby window. And inside one unit, a reality so distorted that it would eventually force the entire country to confront questions far larger than one offender. How can someone descend so far without being stopped? How do institutions fail to recognize escalating danger? What happens when loneliness curdles into fixation and fixation into violence? Why are some victims easier for society to overlook? Why do certain warning signs remain only warnings and never become rescue? Those questions hang over the Dahmer story from the very beginning, even before the public knows enough to ask them clearly. The first true pull of the narrative lies in that tension. Something is wrong, deeply wrong, but not enough people see the shape of it yet. They see fragments, odd behavior, bad smells, an uncomfortable encounter, a young man who never comes home, an explanation that sounds thin but not impossible, a city that keeps functioning because functioning is what cities do, even while something hideous is gestating inside them. That is why the opening of this story must linger in uncertainty, because uncertainty was the atmosphere in which Jeffrey Dahmer thrived. Not total invisibility, but partial visibility. Not complete concealment, but just enough confusion, neglect, and social distance to let him continue building his private world of control. And by the time that uncertainty finally shattered, by the time the sealed room was forced open and the truth came rushing out in a form too dreadful to contain, the country would realize that it had not been looking at one terrible night or one isolated murder. It had been looking, without fully knowing it, at years of hidden predation carried out by a man who learned that if he kept his voice low enough and his life ordinary enough on the surface, he could keep death close beside him without the world immediately understanding what it was seeing. That is the hook in the story. Not simply that the crimes were monstrous, but that they were cultivated in the dead air between neighbors, in the blind spots of authority, in the loneliness of the city, and in the false comfort of believing that the worst horrors must look obvious from the outside. Jeffrey Dahmer proved the opposite. He proved that horror can be quiet, repetitive, procedural, and almost unbearably domestic. He proved that a person can become the center of a nightmare without ever seeming large enough to cast such a shadow. And before this story moves into the setting, the victims, the discoveries, and the reckoning, that is the feeling it must leave behind first, a closed door in an ordinary building, a man no one fully understood, and a darkness accumulating so patiently that when it was finally exposed, it did not feel like a crime had merely been solved. It felt as though the city itself had been forced to look into a room it had been passing for years, and realize that evil had been living there quietly the whole time. Milwaukee in the late 1970s and 1980s was a city that could look solid from a distance, almost stubbornly ordinary, the kind of Midwestern place built on routines, shift work, tavern lights, church steps, bus schedules, and long winters that taught people how to keep going whether they felt like it or not. It was a city of brick apartment buildings and modest houses, of factories and warehouses, of neighborhoods that carried their own histories and accents, storefronts, and loyalties. On certain mornings, the air felt metallic and cold enough to sting the lungs. And on certain summer evenings, the heat pressed low over the streets while radios drifted out of open windows and the smell of beer. Fried food, gasoline, and damp pavement mixed in the dark. It was not a glamorous city, but it was a livable one, built less around spectacle than repetition. People worked, came home tired, watched television, argued in kitchens, paid rent late, borrowed money, attended funerals, got married, got lonely, got drunk, recovered, relapsed, and started again. That ordinary endurance matters because the story of Jeffrey Dahmer did not unfold in a landscape already coded as sinister. It unfolded in a real American city where daily life had enough weight to cover smaller disturbances, until those disturbances became impossible to ignore. The setting of this case is therefore not just a physical location. It is a social atmosphere, a way of life, a pattern of urban existence in which people lived close together while often knowing very little about one another beyond what they could hear through walls or guess from brief encounters in hallways. Milwaukee provided exactly that kind of intimacy without closeness, proximity without real connection, and in the space between those things, danger had room to grow. Dahmer's world was not the world of open landscapes, highways, and wilderness disposal sites. It was enclosed, urban, and claustrophobic. The bars mattered. The bus routes mattered. The apartment mattered. The neighborhoods mattered. The cultural silences mattered. In a city like Milwaukee, especially in the years before every disappearance instantly became a national media storm, a person could slip from one small environment into another without much friction. A man could be one face in a bar, one quiet tenant in a building, one employee at work, one son or former student or neighbor in someone else's passing memory. That kind of fragmented identity can be harmless in most lives. In Dahmer's, it became cover. He did not need to dominate public space. He needed only to move through it without drawing decisive intervention. And the city, like many cities, gave him that possibility. The neighborhood rhythms around him were full of the ordinary distractions that protect privacy as much as they preserve dignity. People did not always ask questions because asking questions meant risk, conflict, embarrassment, or simply becoming involved in someone else's trouble. If there was noise from behind a door, perhaps it was an argument. If there was an odor, perhaps it was bad plumbing, spoiled food, a dead animal in the walls. Anything easier to accept than the truth. If a tenant seemed odd, well, cities contain odd people. Eccentricity alone is not a crime. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in the background of the Dahmer case. Normal urban tolerance, the ability to let others remain private, can become a shield for terrible things when combined with institutional failures and social marginalization. The broader era deepened that shield. America in the 1980s was not a single culture, but a collision of many. And beneath the decade's bright public image of excess, ambition, consumer confidence, and television sheen, there were harder realities running underneath. Industrial cities were changing. Some neighborhoods were absorbing disinvestment, economic strain, and the silent wear of poverty. Racial divisions were not theoretical, they were lived in housing patterns, policing opportunity, and public attention. Gay life existed in visible and invisible forms at once, with bars and social spaces serving as refuge, risk, and necessity for people who could not always live openly elsewhere. To understand Dahmer's setting, one has to understand that many of the men and boys he targeted moved through these pressured spaces. Some were young, broke, drifting, estranged from family, navigating race and class and sexuality in a country that could be casually cruel even before violence entered the frame. Some lived close to the edge of formal protection. That does not mean they were doomed. It means the system around them was less responsive than it should have been to their vulnerability. This case is not only about one offender's pathology. It is also about the environment that made certain lives easier to prey upon and slower to defend. Dahmer himself emerged from a background that, from the outside, could be mistaken for merely troubled, fractured, or sad. That is part of what complicates the story. The early atmosphere around him was not defined by some obvious cinematic descent into evil. It was shaped by emotional dislocation, by a life that seemed to contain detachment as a permanent undertone. There are people who carry loneliness like a wound and move through the world, trying not to let it leak onto others. There are people who carry it like a hunger, transforming private emptiness into grievance, fantasy, or obsession. Dahmer's background belongs to the second category, but the transformation was not publicly legible in clean stages. To many observers, he might have seemed withdrawn, peculiar, immature, or alcohol-soaked long before he was recognized as lethal. Those qualities, damaging as they were, still did not automatically separate him from countless other men falling apart in quieter ways across American cities. That ambiguity helped him. He did not radiate the kind of authority that makes people submit, nor the flamboyant madness that makes people flee. He often seemed muted, passive, almost absent from himself. But passivity can be deceptive. Underneath that drained exterior, there was planning, fixation, and a profound need to control. The setting of this story is therefore not only Milwaukee's streets and buildings, but Dahmer's inner weather, a private climate of isolation, compulsion, and emotional distortion that grew more dangerous the longer it remained unchallenged. One of the most haunting aspects of the background is how domestic it all was on the surface. Apartments, dishes, furniture, beer cans, television glow, cheap carpeting. Hallways that smelled faintly of cigarettes and cleaning fluid. Elevators that worked some days and not others. Neighbors carrying laundry. Police officers doing quick welfare checks. Landlords dealing with complaints. All the minor machinery of city life continued around him. The banality of that machinery is essential to the story's atmosphere. It meant that even when something fell off, people often interpreted it through the familiar lens of ordinary urban dysfunction rather than criminal horror. Cities train people to normalize discomfort. You hear shouting, you assume domestic trouble. You smell something foul, you blame trash or neglect. You see someone intoxicated or strange, you step around them. Much of urban survival depends on selective attention, on learning what to ignore so the sheer volume of stimuli does not overwhelm you. In Dahmer's world, that selective attention became dangerous. The city was alive with movement, but that movement also allowed people to vanish into it. A person at a bus stop, a person leaving a bar, a person entering a building late at night. These were not unusual sights. The threshold between public and private was crossed constantly. And most of the time it meant nothing more than another night unfolding. For Dahmer, that threshold became the critical space. He did not need to lure people into forests or remote roads. He needed only to get them across a doorframe, into a room where the rules changed and outside intervention became unlikely. That is why the apartment matters so much in the background of this case. It was not merely a setting for crimes. It was the architecture of control. A private space in an urban environment can function like a sealed world, especially when no one inside it has reason to expect rescue and no one outside it fully understands what is occurring within. The room, the walls, the locked door, the ordinary furniture, all of it created the false appearance of domestic normalcy while concealing a reality structured around domination and death. The broader social climate also bears directly on the case. Homophobia was not just an attitude in the abstract, it affected how people were seen, how complaints were weighed, how distress was interpreted, and how urgently certain kinds of harm were addressed. Racial bias mattered too, both in vulnerability and in response. When the lives most at risk belong to those society already treats as less central, less protected, less believable, less mourned in advance, predators gain room to operate. Milwaukee did not create Jeffrey Dahmer, but the social fault lines within the city formed part of the terrain on which he moved. He selected people whose disappearances might not trigger an immediate, unified institutional alarm. He operated within communities where mistrust of authorities already existed for good reason and where contact with police did not necessarily feel like safety. This is part of the background that must not be softened in hindsight. The case is not merely the story of one killer and his urges. It is also a portrait of how social neglect becomes usable. The bars he frequented existed within that landscape too. Nightlife is often remembered in true crime as either glamour or danger, but in reality it is usually something more ordinary and sadder. A place where loneliness becomes visible under dim lights. Men drink because they are bored, because they want company, because they want to be seen, because they want not to think for a few hours. Conversations begin and vanish. Trust is negotiated quickly. People go home together for reasons ranging from desire to money to simple fatigue with being alone. In that environment, Dahmer could appear as one more solitary man looking for contact. He did not need a polished persona. He only needed to seem plausible enough for the offer of an invitation to feel like one more. Late-night possibility among many. The city's anonymity did the rest. Anonymity is one of urban life's great bargains. It grants freedom, reinvention, privacy, escape from the watchfulness of smaller communities. But it also means that when a person does not return, the circle of people immediately alerted may be frighteningly small. A family in another state. A friend who assumes plans changed. A roommate who does not know where to start. In Milwaukee's geography of transient work, strained family ties, nightlife, and economic instability, that delay could become fatal even after the crime itself was already over. Dahmer's own habits reinforced the atmosphere of decay. Alcohol was not incidental. It formed part of his background and his method, softening what remained of his conscience while muddying how others perceived him. A drunk man can seem pathetic rather than dangerous. He can be dismissed as one more ruined figure on the urban margins. That too is cover. People around him may have seen disorder, isolation, filth, social awkwardness, and chronic intoxication without imagining the far more disciplined brutality operating underneath. That contrast is crucial. Dahmer was not some criminal mastermind in the theatrical sense. He was disordered in many visible ways. But visible disorder can paradoxically help conceal hidden order because people stop looking deeper. Once they think they understand the explanation. He is just drunk. He is just weird. He is just lonely. He is just a mess. In this case, every one of those assumptions fell disastrously short. The setting and background therefore assemble into a single suffocating mood. A city of hard weather and harder routines. Apartment buildings full of strangers living almost on top of one another. Social spaces where men on the margins searched for company. Institutions shaped by bias, fatigue, and incomplete information. A killer whose surface seemed too flat, too small, too awkward to match the scale of what he was doing. And around all of it, an American culture more prepared to sensationalize horror after the fact than to protect the vulnerable while the horror was still taking shape. That is the world Part 2 must inhabit. Not the revealed nightmare, not yet, but the ordinary shell that held it. The glow of a television through a curtain. The thump of footsteps in a hallway. The stale smell of beer. The hiss of buses in winter slush. The blue-red flicker of a squad car leaving too soon. The quiet resignation of neighbors who keep to themselves. The tired indifference of a city accustomed to carrying more suffering than it can fully register. Somewhere inside that setting, Jeffrey Dahmer was not simply hiding. He was building. He was learning how much could be explained away, how long silence could last, how easy it was for people to mistake warning signs for background noise. And because the world around him was busy surviving its own burdens. Because so many of the people he targeted lived at the intersection of invisibility and risk. Because institutions too often saw fragments instead of patterns. The darkness at the center of his life had years to ripen before it was finally forced into the open. before they became names gathered under the shadow of Jeffrey Dahmer's notoriety. The victims in this case belonged fully to the ordinary, unfinished motion of life. They were not symbols waiting to be folded into a national nightmare. They were young men and boys with habits, moods, private jokes, tensions with family, favorite songs, clothes thrown over chairs, plans postponed until next week, and futures that still felt open enough to change shape many times. Some were sons whose mothers still listened for the sound of their voice on the phone. Some were brothers whose absence left a strange silence at family gatherings. A missing note in the familiar noise of arguing, laughing, borrowing, forgiving. Some were friends who could drift into a room and alter its temperature without trying, making things lighter, louder, easier. Some were quieter, carrying their inner lives with more caution, moving through the world with the kind of guarded hope that grows in people who have already learned not to expect too much from it. To tell the victim's story honestly is to begin there, not with the violence that ended their lives, but with the fact that they had lives at all, distinct ones, textured ones. Lives that did not exist to be arranged around the psychology of the man who killed them. That is the first moral task of this part of the script. To pull them back out of the blur of infamy and let them stand, however briefly, as people who were here. Many of the victims were young, and youth carries its own emotional light. It is not innocence exactly, at least not in the sentimental sense, but momentum. A person in his late teens or 20s often lives with a strange mixture of improvisation and certainty. One day he feels invincible, the next he feels lost, and by evening he has made plans anyway. He may be building a life in fragments, one paycheck, one friendship, one move, one bad decision, one hopeful conversation at a time. Some of the young men who crossed Dahmer's path were living in that raw, transitional stage where adulthood is still being assembled out of rented rooms, uncertain work, strained family ties, late-night bus rides, and the stubborn belief that something better is still possible. Some were trying to make money, some were trying to belong, some were trying to escape loneliness, boredom, rejection, or the dull ache of being unseen. Some were simply moving through the city, looking for companionship, opportunity, or a few hours in which they did not have to feel alone. That ordinariness matters. It matters because predators often build their opportunities from the ordinary needs of other people, and because true respect for victims means refusing to let those needs be misread as weakness. Wanting company is not weakness. Trusting an invitation is not weakness. Being young, broke, restless, curious, or hopeful in a city at night is not weakness. The weakness belonged to the systems that did not guard them well enough, and to the man who saw their humanity as something to exploit rather than honor. Some of the victims came from homes that had already known difficulty. Some may have carried the aftershocks of family conflict, poverty, instability, discrimination, or the brutal small humiliations that accumulate in people who are treated as disposable long before anyone physically harms them. Others may have been more closely held by family, better connected, more visibly expected home. But expectation does not always equal protection. A mother can love her son fiercely and still lose him to a world that sees him differently than she does. A sister can remember every detail of his walk, his laugh, his stubbornness, and still find that none of those details matter enough to institutions unless a case becomes large, public, undeniable. That is part of the sorrow at the center of the Dahmer victim story. The men and boys he targeted were not equally protected by the society around them. Race, age, class, and sexuality all shaped how visible they were and how urgently their absence was felt beyond the circle of those who loved them. Yet within those circles, the urgency was immediate. Someone noticed when they did not return. Someone kept replaying the last conversation. Someone asked around, called numbers, waited by a window longer than pride would normally allow, trying to turn anxiety into a manageable story. Maybe he stayed with a friend. Maybe he missed the bus. Maybe he'll explain tomorrow. Early grief often disguises itself as logistics. People start by solving for the return that never comes. The victim story is also the story of those pauses before reality hardens. Those suspended hours in which families and friends are not yet grieving officially but have already begun to feel the shape of a loss they cannot name. In public memory, the Dahmer case is often told through the grotesque revelations found at the end. Through the apartment, the evidence, the sheer scale of concealed horror. But from the point of view of the victims, that ending was never visible. What existed for them was the immediate world of each day. A phone call not made. A few dollars needed. A bus ride. A conversation in a bar. A thought about what to do tomorrow. A plan vague enough to remain unspoken. Every victim had his own final ordinary afternoon or evening. The last stretch of life before another person's hidden intentions closed around it. If we slow down enough to honor them, we can almost feel the textures of those lives without turning them into fiction beyond recognition. A young man straightening his shirt in a bathroom mirror. Someone laughing too loudly because he has had a little too much to drink and wants the night to keep going. Someone checking pockets for change. Someone thinking of home, but not yet ready to go back. Someone bored. Someone lonely. Someone trying to turn one encounter into a better evening. These are not dramatic gestures. But life is mostly made of undramatic gestures until violence interrupts it. The tragedy is not only that they died. It is that they were alive in such immediate, ordinary ways just beforehand. Some of the victims were very young, which gives the story an especially painful undertone. Youth is often spoken of as if it were abstract beauty, but in reality it is awkward and specific. It is the age of uncertain confidence, borrowed clothes, sudden anger, fast forgiveness. Dreams announced one week and abandoned the next. It is the age at which a person may still be half inside childhood and half performing adulthood, trying out versions of himself before settling into one. To lose a life at that stage is not only to end what already exists. It is to erase a whole field of possible selves. The young man who might have become steadier, gentler, more successful, funnier, wiser, more at peace. The boy who might have become a father, a teacher, a mechanic, an artist, a cook. An older brother people depended on. Violence does not only cancel the present, it murders possibility. That is why the victim's story must breathe with more than biographical fact. It must hold open the futures that were taken too. In a city like Milwaukee, especially for young black men and other marginalized people, life could already require a daily negotiation with danger, surveillance, and invisibility. That context makes the victim's story even more vital. Some were navigating a society that often looked at them with suspicion before it ever looked at them with concern. Some were living at the edge of formal stability, where being missed did not always immediately produce a rapid official response. But being socially vulnerable did not make them less beloved or less real. It meant their humanity was often held most securely in private circles, by mothers, grandmothers, cousins, siblings, friends, lovers. Neighbors who knew how much warmth and character lived inside them long before the public had reason to learn their names. A person can be overlooked by systems and still be the center of someone's world. That contrast lies like a bruise under this entire case. A victim may have been cherished completely in one room and treated as marginal in another. Families carry that knowledge for decades. They know the full emotional size of the life that was lost even when the public only ever encounters a photograph and a paragraph. The language people use after loss can become painfully generic. He was kind. He was funny. He was sweet. He had a good heart. Those phrases are true. But grief repeats them because grief is trying to make the dead legible to strangers. Underneath those phrases are details, and details are what restore the full human outline. Kind may mean he shared food when he had little. Funny may mean he could cut through tension with one perfectly timed look. Sweet may mean he still hugged an older relative with the unself-conscious warmth some people lose too early. A good heart may mean he kept trying, even after disappointment, even after the world gave him reasons to harden. We should imagine those details because they are the texture of personhood. Without them, victims become silhouettes. With them, they return, if only for a moment, to the place they should have occupied all along, the center of their own story. The victim's story also includes the emotional life of the communities around them. In some cases, that community may have been large and visible. In others, it may have been fragmented, improvised, built from whoever was nearby and willing to care. A friend from a bar, a roommate, a former classmate, a cousin who had not spoken to him in a while but still expected to one day. A mother holding on to faith because mothers do that even when evidence has begun to suggest otherwise. People respond to disappearance according to the emotional world they share with the missing person. Some become frantic. Some become methodical. Some shut down because panic feels useless. Some keep telling the same story about the last time they saw him, as if repetition might unlock a detail large enough to reverse fate. Everyone becomes a curator of memory. What was he wearing? What did he say? Was he in a good mood? Did he seem worried? Did he mention anyone? These questions become the structure of early grief because they are all that remains before the machinery of investigation either catches up or fails to. In the Dahmer case, that failure and delay became part of the wound. For some victims, the world did not move quickly enough to honor the urgency of their disappearance because the world had already been taught, by prejudice and habit, to rank some lives as less immediately rescue-worthy than others. That is not just background. It is part of the victim's story. To remember them honestly is to remember the conditions under which they had to move through life in the first place. Yet it would be wrong to define them only by vulnerability. They also possess style, humor, taste, stubbornness, dreams, attraction, confidence, insecurity, and all the contradictory qualities that make a person real. One may have loved music so much that songs still brought him back to his family years later. Another may have been known for the way he dressed, how carefully he assembled himself before going out, how he wanted to be seen. Another may have irritated people he loved with his lateness, his borrowing, his inability to settle down. Another may have been protective in one context and reckless in another. These contradictions are not detours from respect. They are respect. The dead do not need to be polished into saints to deserve mourning. They need only to be acknowledged as fully human, which is more difficult and more honorable. By the time the Dahmer case became one of the most infamous murder cases in American history, the victims risked being absorbed into the enormity of the offender's image. Their names were repeated, but often in the rhythm of evidence, not memory. This part of the story must reverse that. It must linger long enough to feel the ordinary beauty and strain of lives in motion. Young men in a city trying to make it through another week. Sons carrying more tenderness than the world noticed. Friends whose absence left an unfinished silence in the middle of conversations. Boys who should have had more birthdays. Men who should have had the right to age, to fail and recover, to change jobs, to fall in and out of love, to disappoint people and then make amends, to become something else 10 years later. That is what was taken. Not just bodies, not just names, but futures dense with possibility. And that is why the victim's story, in this case, must be told with a steadier gaze than the sensational story that later swallowed it. Because before the apartment, before the headlines, before the evidence forced the city to look into a darkness it had ignored too long, there were individual lives unfolding in ordinary time. They belonged to themselves. They belonged to the people who loved them. They belonged to a future that had not yet narrowed. Jeffrey Dahmer took that future by force, but he does not get to define it. The real center remains with those he targeted, with the young men and boys who should be remembered first not for the horror that found them, but for the human lives they were in the middle of living when the world failed to keep them safe. Night does not become dangerous all at once. In a city, danger often arrives dressed as routine, folded into the same dim streets and neon reflections and tired human appetites that animate everything else after dark. A bus exhales at the curb. A tavern door opens and lets out a pulse of music and cigarette smoke. Someone laughs too loudly on a corner. Someone argues in a parked car. Someone walks home alone because walking home alone is what people do every day in places where life is stitched together by small acts of trust. That is how the incident begins in a case like this, not with a scream heard across the block, not with a sudden public explosion of violence, but with an encounter that seems survivable, forgettable, almost embarrassingly ordinary. A conversation, an offer, a little money, a drink, a place to go for a while, a room with a door. Jeffrey Dahmer understood the emotional weather of those moments with a terrible precision. He knew that loneliness lowers defenses. He knew that boredom can make risk feel negotiable. He knew that a late hour changes the moral scale of a decision, making something that might seem unwise at noon feel acceptable at midnight. Most of all, he knew that private violence is easiest to begin when the first step toward it looks like a choice rather than a trap. That is the true shape of the incident in this story. It is a crossing, a movement from public uncertainty into private control, and it happens so quietly at first that the world outside barely notices it has occurred. Imagine the city in one of those hours when everything seems both exhausted and restless. Streetlights cast weak halos onto wet pavement. Apartment windows glow unevenly. Somewhere a television flickers behind blinds. Somewhere an ice machine rattles. Somewhere a patrol car rolls by without slowing. The victim is still inside ordinary time. He may be thinking about money, company, sex, shelter, a ride. A way to stretch the night into something less empty. He may be wary, but not the right kind of wary. Human beings are rarely wary in the exact shape danger requires. They are wary of robbery, humiliation, bad sex, a fight, a scam, disappointment. They are not usually wary of a man whose fantasies have already advanced far beyond the ordinary. Categories people use to navigate risk. Dahmer benefited from that mismatch. He did not need to seem entirely harmless. He only needed to seem less catastrophic than he was. He could look awkward, subdued, a little off, a little lonely, maybe drunk, maybe strange, but still legible within the ordinary spectrum of men encountered in nightlife, on sidewalks, in transit, at the edges of bars where small bargains are constantly being made between strangers. The incident often begins there, in that fragile space of quick assessment. A victim takes his measure. The man seems odd, but manageable. The offer seems unusual, but possible. The room seems private, but not yet ominous. That is the first cruelty. The victim enters not because he wishes for danger, but because the danger has been disguised as something life has already taught him he can navigate. Once the threshold is crossed, the atmosphere changes in ways that may at first be difficult to name. Every dangerous room contains a second of delayed recognition. The moment when a person senses that the emotional temperature is wrong before he can identify exactly why. It may be in the stillness. It may be in the host's eyes, too fixed or too absent. It may be in an object on a table, a smell in the air, a door closing with too much finality, a silence that does not feel like shyness anymore, but control. This is where the incident stops belonging to the city outside and becomes enclosed within Dahmer's private logic. He did not treat another human being as someone with separate desires and boundaries. He treated presence itself as something to capture. That meant the room was never merely a setting. It was a machine for reducing choice. A drink could be offered. A conversation could continue. Music or television might play. The surface might still resemble a clumsy social interaction for a few more minutes. But underneath that thin social skin, the event is already reorganizing itself around one fact. Only one person in the room understands what is truly happening. The other person is still catching up, still reading signals that shift too quickly from awkwardness to menace. In many crimes, violence is obvious at the outset. Here, horror often advances, through confusion first. A victim may realize that leaving is becoming harder, not yet impossible, but harder. The host's tone changes. His body position changes. An offer becomes insistence. A request becomes pressure. There is often a brief psychological window in which a person tries to normalize what he is sensing. Because normalizing is less frightening than accepting that he is in immediate danger. This is especially true in enclosed social encounters between strangers, where people are conditioned not to escalate too quickly, not to seem dramatic, not to assume the worst. Dahmer's violence fed on that pause. He was not merely stronger in the physical sense when control began. He was advantaged by surprise, by planning, by the victim's delayed recognition that the encounter had crossed into something wholly different from what it pretended to be. Then comes the turn. And in this case, the turn is brutal because it reveals that what seemed accidental or improvised has in fact been structured from the beginning. The room was chosen. The tools were present. The sequence, whether fully planned or not, had already been rehearsed in the offender's mind. By the time the victim understands that he is no longer in an ordinary encounter, but in the grip of someone who does not see him as fully real, the terms of the situation have shifted violently against him. This is where responsible storytelling must be careful. It is not necessary to reproduce every act in grisly detail to convey the horror. What matters is the collapse of autonomy. The body that only minutes earlier moved freely through the city is now trapped inside another person's fantasy of permanent control. The voice that made choices, that laughed, negotiated, flirted, hesitated, argued, or agreed, is now being forced into silence. The future that existed one bus stop, one drink, one wrong doorframe ago is suddenly under assault by someone who has been practicing, in his mind and then in reality, how to turn living people into possessions. That is the incident at its core. Not merely murder, but the violent erasure of another person's separateness. Dahmer's crimes were uniquely chilling because the act did not end emotionally where death began. His compulsion was built around possession, and that meant the moment of violence carried an especially suffocating psychological force. He was not exploding in rage and walking away. He was trying to solve, through domination, the unbearable fact that other human beings cannot be made to remain. The incident, therefore, feels almost ritualized in its emotional structure, even when the outward specifics vary. First contact, threshold crossing, growing unease, restriction, recognition, panic, control, silence. Beneath it all, one fixed idea: that another person's life can be subordinated completely to the offender's need. That is what makes these incidents so difficult to contemplate. They're not random in the loose sense. They are intimate, repetitive, and organized around a fantasy so devoid of reciprocity that it cannot coexist with another person's freedom for more than a few moments. For the victims, the terror would have come not only from pain but from the speed with which the social world fell away. One instant there is still a city outside, traffic, hallways, neighbors, a whole ordinary human environment humming just beyond reach. The next instant that environment feels impossibly distant. This is one of the most haunting aspects of urban predation. People imagine that density protects, that walls and nearby strangers create safety. But density can also hide private violence by making each separate room feel like someone else's business until it is too late. In an apartment building, one person may be dying while another reheats leftovers, while another brushes teeth, while another laughs at a late-night sitcom, while another complains about noise but does not understand its source. The incident is therefore doubly horrifying. It unfolds in private, but private here means only a few feet away from ordinary life, separated by architecture and silence rather than geography. That thinness between the normal and the monstrous is part of what makes the Dahmer case linger in public memory with such suffocating power. The city remains present throughout, but useless. After the moment of violence, the secondary incident begins, though no one outside the room fully understands it yet. Someone is now missing, though perhaps not immediately noticed. Someone will fail to arrive, fail to call, fail to appear where expected. But in many of these cases, the outside world does not react at once with unified alarm. There may be too much distance between the victim and those who love him. Too much instability in his life for one missed night to automatically trigger an emergency. That delay is part of the offender's advantage. He operated in the cruel gap between a person's disappearance and society's willingness to interpret that disappearance as a crisis. In some cases, the gap was shaped by youth, in others by race, in others by sexuality, class, transience, or the simple fact that adult men are often presumed to have chosen absence even when absence has been chosen for them. That presumption is its own form of vulnerability. It means the incident can remain sealed inside the room longer than it should. No one pounds the door. No one calls the building manager in a panic. No patrol car arrives in time. The public world continues, and the offender, because he has rehearsed this emotional detachment, continues too. There is another dimension to the incident that matters in this case. Dahmer's outward manner did not always match the violence he intended, and that mismatch likely intensified the disorientation of the people he targeted. A man who is blustering or openly threatening can be understood quickly. A man who remains eerily flat, awkward, or subdued while exerting lethal control produces a different kind of terror. It feels unreal at first, as though the room has slipped sideways out of normal logic. That surreal quality is one reason survivors of dangerous encounters often describe time differently. Afterward, moments stretch. Details become hyperclear. The mind tries to make meaning while the body tries to survive. In cases where victims did not survive, the only trace of that internal struggle is what investigators later infer from the room. The disorder, the sequence, the evidence left behind. But even without direct testimony, the psychological shape is visible. The incident was never simply an attack. It was the imposition of a private world in which empathy had collapsed and another person's fear became irrelevant. Outside, however, the city kept breathing. Morning would eventually come. Someone would walk a dog past the building. Someone would collect mail. Someone would head to work with a coffee in hand. A relative somewhere might think to call. A friend might assume the victim had met someone and stayed over. Ordinary explanations would continue to protect the offender for a little longer. Not because the people around the victim cared less, but because ordinary life teaches people to begin with the plausible. It is almost unbearable to realize how often horror depends on that habit. We start with the harmless explanation because to start with the truth would make normal life impossible. Dahmer lived inside that human tendency and used it as cover. By the time the incident had fully passed, one more life had been removed from the public world and folded into the offender's private geography of control. One more person had vanished not in a blaze of public violence, but in the quiet after an invitation. One more absence had been created in a family, a group of friends, a neighborhood memory. And yet the room itself still looked, from the outside, like part of an ordinary building. That is the final, unbearable note of Part 4. The incident leaves almost no visible mark on the city in the moment it happens. The street remains the street. The hallway remains the hallway. The night rolls forward. Only later, when investigators and the public learn what these rooms contained and what these encounters meant, does the full emotional scale of the incident become legible. Then the ordinary details become poisoned in retrospect. A knock on a door, a late-night conversation, a promised drink, an offer of money, a quiet man in glasses. The terrible power of this case lies partly in that retroactive corruption. It forces the world to look back at moments that seemed small and understand that within those small moments entire lives were being rerouted toward catastrophe. That is how the incident should be remembered here, not as a spectacle, but as a series of deceptively quiet crossings in which young men and boys, still carrying all the unfinished momentum of their lives, stepped through what looked like an ordinary threshold, and entered the closed, predatory world of a man who had learned how to make normality itself serve as camouflage until it was far too late. The discovery did not begin with understanding. It began with shock, with movement so sudden and panicked that for a moment it seemed almost too chaotic to hold meaning. A young man burst from the apartment and into the hallway carrying terror on his body like heat, not the abstract fear of someone who has seen something strange, but the raw, immediate fear of someone who has crossed the line between suspicion and certainty and knows, with the animal clarity that arrives only in extremity, that if he is pulled back through that door, he may never come out again. That is the true beginning of Part 5 in this story. Not the cameras, not the evidence bags, not the headlines that would later stamp Jeffrey Dahmer's name into national memory, but the instant private horror failed to remain private. Until then, the apartment had functioned like a sealed chamber within the city, an enclosed world where smell, silence, and unease had been explained away just enough times to let the truth keep growing in the dark. But once a victim escaped that enclosure and brought the terror into public space, the whole hidden architecture of the case began to crack. There are moments in major investigations when the world seems to pivot in place, when an ordinary hallway, an ordinary patrol response, an ordinary apartment entry suddenly become the threshold between ignorance and revelation. This was one of those moments. The first officers who arrived were not stepping into a myth yet. They were responding to a live complaint, one more call in a profession saturated with disorder, intoxication, fear, half-clear statements, and the constant need to judge quickly what is real, what is exaggerated, what is dangerous, what can wait. That practical routine matters because it sharpens the moral weight of what happened next. The apartment would not have announced itself immediately as the center of one of the most infamous murder cases in American history. From the outside, it was still a door in a hallway, a unit among other units. A private residence in a building where neighbors had already learned to absorb discomfort as background noise. But inside, the air had already been altered by years of violence, concealment, and decay. Once the officers crossed that threshold, they entered not just a crime scene, but a sustained private reality so depraved and controlled that the discovery would unfold less like the solving of one crime than like the peeling back of layer after layer of accumulated horror. Crime scenes usually announce themselves through some visible rupture. Blood where it should not be, furniture overturned, the obvious geometry of struggle, the unmistakable signs that violence has just occurred. The apartment, in this case, did contain visible evidence. But what made it unforgettable was not one single dramatic sight. It was the total atmosphere, the feeling that the room itself had been slowly taught to tolerate the intolerable. There was the smell first, heavy, invasive, impossible to classify innocently once attention focused on it. People later remember smell in cases like this because smell bypasses interpretation and hits the body before the mind can organize what it means. It is intimate, humiliating, undeniable. A foul odor in an apartment building can be explained away for weeks by plumbing, garbage, rot, neglect, dead animals on the walls, anything except the truth. But once officers began actually looking, once drawers and surfaces and containers ceased to be ordinary domestic objects and became potential evidence, the explanations that had protected the apartment began to collapse one by one. The discovery is often imagined in public memory as a single awful instant, one glance, one revelation, one collective recoil. In reality, scenes like this unfold through sequence. An object is noticed. It does not fit. A second object confirms the first. A photograph is seen. Then another. A container is opened. A refrigerator is examined. A corner of the room acquires a meaning it did not visibly carry moments earlier. The emotional force builds not because the scene is chaotic, but because it is coherent. Every fresh detail supports the emerging truth that this is not an isolated killing hastily covered up. This is a system. This is repetition. This is someone who has been living beside evidence of his own crimes long enough for the domestic environment itself to become an accomplice to concealment. That is what made the initial discovery so devastating for the officers on scene. They were not encountering the aftermath of a sudden outburst. They were encountering the remains of an entire hidden structure of domination and death. The apartment had been organized, however grotesquely, around the offender's private needs. Ordinary household space had been repurposed into storage, concealment, ritual, and fantasy. Every familiar object, therefore, became morally unstable. A drawer might hold what no drawer should hold. A kitchen, the symbolic center of nourishment and daily survival, could become the site of revulsion. The bed, the walls, the containers, the photographs. Each element of domestic life had been contaminated by intent. That contamination is why crime scenes like this linger so powerfully in the imagination. They do not merely show that violence occurred. They show that violence had been normalized within the offender's private world for so long that the environment itself was arranged around it. For the officers, the initial clue was not just one object or one set of restraints or one image. The initial clue was the dawning recognition that the victim who escaped had not exaggerated, had not panicked irrationally, had not stumbled into a merely rough or drunken encounter. He had escaped from a place structured around real and immediate danger. Once that recognition took hold, the pace of the scene changed. Procedure sharpened. Rooms were no longer just rooms. They became sectors of evidence. The suspect was no longer merely suspicious. He became the custodian of a concealed world that had to be frozen, documented, and understood before anything within it could be dismissed as coincidence. And that, in a case of this scale, is where the discovery becomes the first true act of justice. Before the courtroom, before the confessions, before the public outrage. There is the moment when the hidden space is seized from the offender and placed under the authority of law. He no longer controls what can be seen. He no longer controls the timing. He no longer controls the story. But the scene did not give up its meaning neatly. Investigators had to read it while standing inside a sensory assault. In some cases, the first challenge is preserving a site from contamination. Here, there was the additional challenge of emotional containment. People can train for homicide, for decomposition, for violence. But there are scenes that break past professional expectation because they reveal not one act of cruelty, but a prolonged philosophy of it. The photographs mattered enormously for that reason. Images do what verbal explanation cannot. They pin time down. They convert suspicion into sequence. They reveal that what might have been argued as fantasy or drunken exaggeration was in fact real, repeated, and recorded. For detectives, those images were not lurid details. They were keys. They connected missing persons to the room. They connected the room to the offender's pattern. They transformed what could have been a single dramatic arrest into the opening of a much larger homicide investigation. This is why Part 5, the crime scene and initial clues, must be told with patience. The discovery did not only expose what was in the apartment. It exposed how the case itself would have to be understood from that moment forward. Before the apartment was entered, there were disappearances, suspicions, fragments, individual absences that had not yet been drawn into one undeniable shape. After the apartment was entered, fragmentation began to end. The scene offered physical proof that a hidden pattern existed and that the pattern radiated outward, far beyond one surviving victim's ordeal. In serial crime investigations, that transition is everything. The crime scene stops being a location and becomes a map. Each object suggests a person. Each person suggests a timeline. Each timeline suggests another missing life, another family waiting, another earlier failure to intervene. A refrigerator or dresser or stack of photographs is no longer just evidence of one night. It is evidence of years. The apartment became, in effect, an archive of the offender's own secrecy. The very thing he believed he controlled, now furnishing investigators with the means to dismantle him. Yet the scene was more than evidentiary. It carried an emotional charge that extended instantly beyond law enforcement. Neighbors who had sensed something was wrong but could never have imagined the scale would later be forced to reinterpret months or years of uneasy coexistence. The smells, the noises, the glimpses, the complaints, all of it would be dragged backward through the new knowledge until ordinary memory itself became accusatory. Did they ignore too much? Did anyone ask enough? Could anyone have known? Those questions haunt communal discoveries. But responsibility in such cases must remain clear. Neighbors are not forensic units. Ordinary people do not owe the world prophetic certainty. The true burden falls on the person who built the horror and on the institutions that encountered warning signs without assembling them fast enough. Still, once a crime scene is discovered, everyone in its orbit becomes a reluctant witness to hindsight. The building changes. The hallway changes. Even the air outside the unit feels different because a truth has entered it that cannot be pushed back into secrecy. For detectives, the first clues inside the apartment would have generated not relief, but a harsher kind of urgency. Evidence of multiple victims means every unidentified item is another human being awaiting restoration to name and family. Remains require processing, forensic comparison, methodical reconstruction. Personal effects must be matched, timelines redrawn, prior reports revisited, jurisdictions contacted, old assumptions challenged. A discovery of this magnitude does not simplify an investigation at first. It explodes it. It gives law enforcement a solid center, yes, but it also reveals the scale of what has to be accounted for. How many victims? Over how many years? Which missing persons files now connect? Which encounters with police now have to be re-examined? What exactly happened in this apartment and how many times? Those are not questions answered on the first night. The first night only makes them impossible to avoid. There is another aspect of the discovery that must be held carefully. The dignity of the victims returns, paradoxically, through procedure. Dahmer had tried to convert human beings into things, into trophies, into components of a private fantasy where their personhood no longer mattered. The crime scene investigation reverses that transformation one fragment at a time. What he treated as objects become remains, then evidence, then identities, then sons and brothers and names spoken aloud again. That reversal is slow and incomplete and cannot undo what was done, but it matters deeply. The evidence technicians, detectives, forensic examiners, and later medical staff were not merely cataloging horror. At their best, they were rescuing individuality from the place where it had been most violently denied. A bone fragment, a photograph, a personal item. None of it seems like enough against the scale of the damage. But in the logic of justice, these fragments matter because they refuse erasure. They say this person was here. This person existed. This person can still be brought back into the human record despite everything the offender did to reduce him. As dawn or the next stage of processing approached, the apartment would have become quieter in a different way. Less the silence of concealment and more the silence of method. Cameras click. Gloves snap. Evidence markers appear. Conversations turn brief and technical because technical language is one way professionals protect themselves from emotional collapse while standing inside unbearable scenes. Outside, word begins to spread. Inside, every new clue tightens the case and expands the grief. That dual motion defines this part of the story. Discovery is both illumination and devastation. It brings knowledge, but knowledge here is not comforting. It is corrosive. It forces everyone involved to understand that the city had been living beside a chamber of recurring death, that ordinary institutions had brushed against it more than once, and that the surviving victim's escape had opened a door not just on one assault, but on a hidden sequence of crimes far larger than the first responders could have grasped when they arrived. By the end of this stage, the apartment is no longer private space. It is public fact. It belongs to the investigation now, to the victims now, to the record of the dead and the living who must speak for them. The initial clues have done their work. They have converted suspicion into proof, horror into evidence, and a fleeing man's fear into the first crack in the offender's long control over the story. That is what Part 5 means here. The crime scene was not merely discovered.
It was forced to speak.
And when it spoke, it did so with such terrible authority that the entire case changed in an instant. The city, the police, the nation, all would soon understand that they were not looking at an isolated act, but at the exposed interior of a long-hidden machinery of violence. The door had finally opened, and on the other side was not confusion anymore, but the beginning of undeniable truth. By the time the apartment had been opened to law enforcement and the first unbearable facts had begun to settle into evidence, the investigation entered a different phase, one less defined by mystery than by reconstruction, but no less painful for that. Part 6 in this story is not the dramatic hunt for an unknown man still moving freely through the
city.
Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer hidden in the ordinary sense. He was in custody. The face attached to the horror was now visible. And yet the case was still surrounded by a different kind of darkness. Because arrest is not understanding, and discovery is not closure. Once investigators realized the scale of what had been concealed inside that apartment, the question changed from who to how, and then almost immediately from how to how long. That shift matters. In many investigations, the arrest narrows the emotional field. The danger has been contained, the suspect identified, the path toward prosecution begun. Here, the arrest blew the field open. Every item recovered suggested another life. Every photograph implied another missing hour, another room entered, another family that might not yet know the truth. Detectives were no longer searching a city for a predator. They were now searching backward through years of silence, trying to determine how many times the predator had already succeeded while everyone around him mistook fragments for background noise. The investigation became a race against absence itself. Missing persons reports had to be reopened, compared, reconsidered. Old dates were pulled forward into new relevance. Names that had once floated separately through police systems now had to be placed beside one another and asked whether they belonged to a single pattern. That kind of work has none of the cinematic elegance people imagine when they think of criminal investigation. It is bureaucratic, repetitive, exhausting, and emotionally corrosive. Detectives sit with files, photographs, witness statements, forensic reports, old call logs, scattered addresses, maps, bus routes, employment records, bar memories, landlord's complaints, prior police contacts, medical examiner notes. They cross-reference the dead against the missing, the unidentified against the remembered, the preserved object against the human being who once carried it. It is painstaking because it has to be. A mistake at this stage does not merely slow the case. It risks erasing someone a second time. The apartment had already provided a grim center of gravity. But the apartment alone could not tell the entire story. A crime scene can preserve traces of a pattern without automatically identifying every person caught inside it. So investigators had to build the pattern in layers. They interviewed Dahmer, not simply to secure statements, but to map his internal chronology against the physical chronology of the evidence. They examined where his memory aligned with reality and where it slipped, minimized, distorted, or omitted. Serial offenders do not confess like ordinary people admit wrongdoing. They narrate, they edit, they posture, they evade. They disclose selectively, sometimes because they want attention, sometimes because they want control, sometimes because memory itself has been distorted by repetition and intoxication and self-mythology. Dahmer presented a particular challenge because his outward effect could seem calm, almost drained of visible emotion, which in some contexts reads as honesty even when it is merely detachment. Investigators had to work against that false impression. A subdued tone is not truth. A matter-of-fact description is not remorse. They were dealing with a man who had spent years collapsing other people's humanity into objects. Inside his own mind. Any account he offered, therefore, had to be tested relentlessly against evidence, because the private logic that governed his crimes could not be trusted to produce a clean public narrative afterward. This is the real dead end inside Part 6. And it is different from the one found in an unsolved manhunt. The dead end here was moral, institutional, and retrospective. Detectives kept running into the same unbearable realization. The signs had been there. Not all of them were obvious. Not all of them pointed clearly to homicide. But enough of them existed that, once assembled after the arrest, they formed a pattern of missed interventions that no one could comfortably ignore. Odor complaints, strange behavior, encounters with police. A surviving victim's terror that had almost been returned to its source. Each piece, when isolated in real time, had seemed containable within some lesser category of disorder. A difficult tenant, a drunk, a domestic problem, a sexual dispute, a mentally troubled man. But once the apartment opened and the pattern emerged, those smaller categories collapsed. The investigation had to reckon not only with what Dahmer had done, but with the spaces in which institutions had touched the edges of his violence without forcing the full truth into view. That is why this phase of the story is so psychologically devastating. The suspect had been found, and still the case generated fresh helplessness. Detectives were no longer powerless in the immediate sense. Dahmer was under arrest. Yet every hour of investigation seemed to reveal another earlier hour in which someone might have been saved if the system had been sharper. If prejudice had not dulled urgency. If unease had been treated as possible danger rather than inconvenience. That retrospective knowledge produces a special kind of grief inside law enforcement. It is not the grief of losing the hunt. It is the grief of understanding too late what the hunt should have been about all along. For some investigators, this becomes professional fury. For others, it hardens into quiet determination. For still others, it settles into the private burden of memory they carry long after public attention moves on. Because the deeper they dug, the more the case exposed not a single catastrophic oversight, but a network of smaller failures that, taken together, had given Dahmer years. Meanwhile, the city around the investigation began to absorb what had happened, and that absorption was uneven. Some people reacted with horror at the scale, some with disgust, some with a kind of fascinated disbelief that can feel almost obscene to those closest to the victims. Media attention intensified, and with it came another investigative challenge. Once a case becomes national spectacle, every fact is at risk of becoming performance. Reporters want timelines before timelines are stable. Commentators want psychological explanations before evidence is fully processed. The public wants one sentence that can convert chaos into meaning. But investigators at this stage do not have the luxury of neat meaning. They have tasks. Identify remains. Notify families. Separate confirmed victims from possible victims. Determine sequence. Reconstruct contacts. Understand method. Corroborate statements. Prepare the case for prosecution without compromising its factual integrity under the weight of public pressure. The dead end, in that sense, was the impossibility of doing this kind of work quickly enough to satisfy outrage while still doing it well enough to honor the dead. Families existed inside their own version of the investigation. For them, the suspect was no longer a rumor or abstraction. He had a face, a name, a body in custody, and yet that did not provide peace. Peace requires answers, and answers came slowly, often in forms too painful to absorb at once. A family might learn that a son or brother was likely among the victims, but still have to wait for formal confirmation. They might be contacted by authorities and feel both desperate for information and terrified of what information would do to them once it arrived. There is no good way to tell a mother that the uncertainty she has lived with is ending because something terrible has finally been found. There is no humane shortcut through that conversation. The investigation therefore moved on two tracks at once, the evidentiary and the human. On one track, forensic teams processed what the apartment and related sites could yield. On the other, detectives and officials became carriers of unbearable truth into homes where people had spent months or years trying to survive without it. That dual responsibility can make investigators feel split in two. One part of the mind remains technical. The other cannot help but register every parent's face, every stunned silence, every question that has no answer large enough to satisfy it. There is another suspect in Part 6 as well, though not in the literal criminal sense. It is the suspect of public imagination, the temptation to make the entire case legible by reducing it to one word like monster, evil, insane. As though those labels close the gap between the ordinary man in custody and the years of hidden violence now being reconstructed around him. Investigators had to resist that simplification too. Not because the crimes were anything less than monstrous, but because legal and factual understanding demands specificity. How did he choose victims?
What opportunities did he exploit?
How did he conceal evidence? Why were some disappearances not linked earlier? Which prior contacts with authorities were mischances and why? A vague label of evil may satisfy the public emotionally, but it does not solve the investigative problem. The problem was systems, timelines, victims, proof, sequence, motive as it relates to prosecution, and the practical anatomy of concealment. Dahmer's psychology mattered, but only insofar as it illuminated his behavior and helped the case be understood in a way that could withstand legal scrutiny. As investigators continued, the pattern of victimization revealed another layer of the dead end. The victims had often lived at the intersection of visibility and invisibility. Visible enough to be vulnerable in public. Invisible enough that their disappearances did not always trigger immediate, expansive institutional response. Many were young, many were Black or from other marginalized backgrounds. Some moved through gay social spaces in a society still structured by homophobia, stigma, and selective empathy. Those conditions did not cause Dahmer's crimes, but they shaped the environment in which he could commit them with less immediate interruption than he should ever have had. The investigation therefore became, whether officials welcomed it or not, an exposure of social hierarchy. It asked brutally whose disappearances are treated as emergencies and whose are treated as drift. It asked whose fear is believed right away and whose is interpreted through suspicion or contempt. These were not abstract moral questions. They were embedded in the case itself, in the lost time, in the prior contacts, in the silence surrounding certain absences. The dead-end investigators kept meeting was not simply the offender's secrecy. It was the world's unequal readiness to recognize danger when that danger touched some lives rather than others. And still the work had to continue, one victim at a time, one identification at a time, one reconstructed timeline at a time, one interview at a time. Dahmer's apartment had yielded clues, but clues are not the same as names. And names matter because law without names can become sterile. A count of victims horrifies the public. A name wounds it properly. A name returns a person to history. The investigation's real dignity lay there, in its refusal to leave the dead as anonymous evidence. The more detectives learned, the more each victim had to be reassembled from the thin surviving record of who he had been before he crossed Dahmer's path. Friends had to be located. Families had to be asked questions no loving person should ever hear. Last sightings had to be revisited with the knowledge of what they now meant. Even after the suspect was known, the dead end persisted because so much of the real case was still hidden in the damage he had already done. In that sense, Part 6 becomes the emotional middle chamber of the whole story. The surface mystery is over, but a deeper reckoning has begun. Dahmer is no longer the unidentified threat. He is the known center of a widening circle of grief and institutional self-examination. The investigation is no longer about catching him. It is about understanding the full radius of harm. about forcing each missed warning and each overlooked victim back into the light, about refusing the comfort of a simple ending. Because there was no simple ending available. Arrest had stopped the future crimes, but it could not restore the past. It could not erase the hallway where neighbors had walked by. It could not undo the earlier police contacts. It could not change the social conditions that made some young men easier to prey upon. It could not give families back the years lost to uncertainty.